Neil, most partnerships look sensible on paper. Why do so many still fail to launch or end up in a messy divorce?
Really good question. And I think the answer is probably baked right into the question itself, actually. So I would say a lot of times things can look good on paper because on paper we're looking at things like business strategy, finance, our respective capabilities, etc. But what we can often fail to look at is the people side of the story. And really, as I'm sure we're going to get into today, it's people that make partnerships work, or in the case of a messy divorce, not work.
Yeah,
And so that's the bit that's really hard to discern from the paper, but that's the critical piece.
brilliant. So we're going to have a conversation about partnerships, collaborations, and mergers, but we work in two slightly different worlds. So you're a founder of Health Advance Connect. You work with health industry leaders to collaborate with purpose and execute with clarity. And I know that because I got it from your LinkedIn profile. These are health science collaborations across academia, industry, and health systems, and we'll learn a bit more about that as we go through. I set up Loom Consulting to help for-purpose organizations specifically to navigate collaborations and mergers for sustainability and scale of impact. And I reckon they're different worlds, but there are lots of similarities. So today we'll look to practical ways to view partnerships and mergers, to recognize pitfalls, how to dodge them, when to walk away, and how to make it work.
Sounds good. No, I'm really excited to get into this. As I say, quite different worlds, but there's going to be a lot of overlap there, which I'm excited to get into.
Beautiful. All right. So in some of the great LinkedIn articles you've written, Neil, you want to get starting with they have capabilities we need when you view partnerships. What's a better starting intent?
So I think a far better starting point is we have shared purpose. And I'll explain why. So if we're starting from the point of they have the capabilities we need, you really just focused on what you can get out in the relationship, and you're placing too much emphasis on your own organization's wins, which isn't really a true partnership. I often use analogies of, human relationships, marriage, etc. As you've seen from my article, if you entered a marriage with that mindset of what can I get out of it, that's going to end in a messy divorce. But in alliances, coming back to that idea of it's better to start with a shared purpose, I think that's a much better starting point. Particularly if you've got a mindset of service outside of the two or however many organizations. So whether that's shared customers, consumers. In my world, it's usually thinking about the patient and what we can do to enhance patient impact.
Okay.
That takes the partnership to a high level, right? So we're not thinking internally about what we can get. We're thinking externally about the impact that we're making in the world. And I think if we can do that enables the partnership to endure all those bumps along the road because it keeps us focused on what's really important.
Yeah. Okay. And what's the early sign that intent is wrong, even if strategy and the due diligence between partners looks good?
So in my experience, the earliest sign is when I start working with the team on the ground and no one can explain to me what we're doing in their own words. It either means that they're not bought into the alliance or partnership or whatever we're exploring, or that intent is still nebulous, right? So, both of those things are disastrous if left unchecked. So you either need to work on buy-in or you need to work on actually painting a more rich picture of what we're trying to achieve. The good news, though, is the exercise of working through that, working through that collective purpose, that vision for an alliance is a great way both to set that North Star as a kind of product of the exercise, but the process of the exercise as well actually works to bring the teams together. So it's a disaster if left unchecked, but it's actually an opportunity to work on something together and start to build those kind of teaming behaviors. When I think about mergers, and you talk about in for-purpose mergers, Is there any danger of, that equivalent tendency to go for a capability grab? And if so, how do you redirect that?
It's pretty similar in a for purpose context. When I'm helping clients explore collaborations and mergers, the first thing you do is get everyone to define and articulate that North Star. And as you say, that's very powerful in as an exercise itself, but it also sets the high purpose for the work we do together. It's essentially the same issue. So too often organizations and people within them see collaboration as a way to further their own interests, to offset weaknesses, or to help them grow. And the way to get past it, and it's not easy, is to hold a mirror to them. Help them recognize that the priority, the reason that they got into that organization as either executive or a director is the vision, that North Star that we referred to. It might be curing a disease, helping people in trouble, saving animals, or whatever. And that North Star transcends their own organization. And maybe the best path towards that North Star isn't through them as they are today. Maybe it's through another organization, maybe it's through a partnership, maybe it's that they will need to give something up in order to move forward. So I think it's a very similar experience in a full purpose context.
Yeah, excellent. And where does that kind of service outside our own organization idea show up in merger decision making?
Well, fundamentally, it's that idea of laying aside an organization's own interests in order to move forward towards that higher purpose. In some extreme cases, an organization's stubborn determination to survive and plow on regardless and independently actually wastes the precious and limited resources that have been given for that higher purpose. Waste them on organizational survival rather than finding ways to deliver on that purpose. So you get this great irony that in this way, sometimes organizations become the impediment to delivering the vision that they're supposed to be striving towards. So in a more tangible way, service outside of your organization shows up in things like leaders having open conversations about how to work together towards that common purpose. It might be collaboration appearing on a board meeting agenda. And organizations willing and committing to give things up in order to better serve their beneficiaries.
Yeah, makes sense. And I imagine that kind of transcends the not-for-profit realm as well. I think there's some lessons there for profit-based organizations as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So Neil, in one of your articles, I read about 4 factors, success factors that can help define effective partnerships. One of them is shared purpose. And in mergers, we often think purpose is shared because missions sound similar. What do you do to make it real across organizations and within organizations?
Yeah, good question. I think let's first of all kind of take a step back. I think first thing we need to clarify, is this like a project-based alliance that is going to achieve a goal in some time frame, be that a couple of years or whatever? Or is this something that we're looking to set up as an enduring alliance with kind of no end in mind? And I think once we've clarified that, I think that kind of takes us down different paths. If it's a project-based alliance, absolutely fine, but I think we need to be clear on that. We need to set what that goal is and understand what we're looking to get out of that from all of the organizations, and understand what point in time it is that we've achieved that purpose and we can walk away.
Yeah.
But in the realm of more enduring alliances, which is really what I'm kind of really focused on in my work more often than not, it's really important that we spend the time to kind of get under the surface of that purpose. And it needs to really make sense and resonate with everyone involved. So it can't be one of those kind of motherhood statements that sounds grand and fantastic, but doesn't really mean anything to people, going back to what I was saying earlier.
Yeah.
So it helps to get below the detail, below the surface into the detail, so that all teams, departments can actually understand where they fit within that shared purpose. And the other thing that's important, and I don't know if you kind of read Simon Sinek. I'm a Simon Sinek fan myself.
Yeah.
He writes about the infinite game. I think that framing is really important in enduring alliances, right? So our purpose, this is why I provide that clarification at the beginning. Our purpose needs to be something that isn't going to be achieved in 2 to 3 years' time. It's that kind of never-ending pursuit of better and better, again, in my world, patient impact, or whatever it is. So you need to have that test of your purpose to make sure it is something that we can essentially work on for the rest of our existence.
Yeah.
Which is the really exciting, lofty goals, which is what we should really be focused on in these enduring alliances. Moving that into your world, how do you keep the big picture alive? Because that's what we're talking about with shared purpose. How do you keep that alive in a merger environment when the day-to-day pressures are starting to kick in?
Well, this is tough, really tough. Leaders in the for-purpose sector generally work really hard, long hours, resource-constrained environments, unreliable revenue models. And so there really isn't much opportunity to think strategically, to lift your head and look for collaborative opportunities when managing operations can be so all-consuming. So the how you do it, obviously, time management 101, put time in your diary to think about the most important things, to think strategically so you're not distracted by something urgent that crops up. Lift yourself out the weeds, or all those sorts of cliches. Good time management can create the space to think about collaborations and to focus on that higher purpose.
Yeah, great.
But in that spare time, develop the skill of thinking about not just how your organization is operating, but whether working with other aligned organizations might help you further your mission or move you further towards your vision. And the second tactic I would use is directed to board members. Put the topic of collaboration on the next board agenda and have brave conversations about what collaborations might offer, what might be holding you back. Those sort of conversations at board level can be really transformational in a very short space of time. And board members generally have a little bit more time and space to discuss strategic matters, whereas CEOs are often pulled into operations in these kind of challenging, tricky organizations we manage.
Yeah, fantastic. I just had a kind of a thought there. I need to take some of that learning into my own organization, right? So oftentimes we can talk quite compellingly about what our clients should be doing, and we forget to do it ourselves. So one of my things this year is to make sure that I'm looking to partner with other people, other consultants, where purpose aligns. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that. I think that's important.
So the second lever you talked about in your article, I noted, was aligned leadership and the importance of aligned leadership. Can you explain a bit more about how that plays out, please, and why it's so powerful?
Yeah, so with aligned leadership, it's super important, right? Because you're always going to face complexities and setbacks in alliances. Alliances are hard, right? Yeah. And if you don't have that aligned leadership, it's very easy for things to start to unravel quite quickly. And I think it can be quite easy for leadership to be aligned when things are easy, when the going's good and everyone's happy. Aligned leadership, it's not a challenge, and I would argue that you can't really see if there is aligned leadership until you reach those setbacks. I think that the kind of the first test for a leader of an alliance or within an alliance is when if you're in firm X, say, and your team start grumbling about firm Y, right? Yeah. Because that happens. I think anyone that's worked in these environments will recognize that. Now, the easy thing to do is placate to that grumbling and say, oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. So-and-so is hacking me off too. And that might seem easy. It might even seem like the right thing to do because you're kind of buoying up your team member. But, that can be quite insidious, right? Because you're signaling, you're allowing that faction to occur, that crack to occur. And that starts to really snowball and kind of build until, we're into our separate tribes again, and the alliance goes. So that real test is do you as a leader in that moment stand by your alliance partner, even and especially actually when they're not in the room, and basically stick up for your alliance partner
Yeah.
and stick up for the alliance.
I smiled during your answer because I was reminded of The Office, the British Office, where they talk about that swindled lot being slugs, I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah, a great example of how not to do things.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. David Brent, not the archetype alliance leader. What does aligned leadership look like when complexities and setbacks hit for you?
Well, it's challenging is the first thing to acknowledge. And going into a process as sensitive and tricky as a merger, you need to acknowledge things will not always go smoothly despite best efforts. So having kind of permission to have awkward conversations at times is really important, kind of price of entry. But how to resolve those setbacks or complexities? Firstly, that clarity of purpose. All leaders, executives, directors, and all side need to make some level of commitment. They put aside their own interests and fears and ego in order to pursue that purpose. Be brave, have clear and honest communication, and a clear decision-making process based on that higher purpose. So, for example, I'm working at the moment with two organizations that essentially serve the same client group. And their collaboration has the best interests of the clients they serve as the key determinant in any decision making. So when there are thorny issues like leadership or brand or mission statement come up, there's an objective way to work through them by using that higher purpose as the kind of defining criteria decisions are made. And it's not easy. In some emergency cases where one organization is struggling with financial pressure and they go, we've got to merge or die, those decisions have to be made really quickly. And in many cases, the reality of that situation makes the decisions for you. But in more strategic and managed mergers, like the example I gave a little earlier, the decision-making framework focused on a shared purpose is the best arbiter.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think you're also showing that these success factors aren't necessarily discrete, that they kind of mix together, right? So we started with shared purpose, we've gone to aligned leadership. Part of that aligned leadership is recognizing the shared purpose.
Yeah. The third lever you talk about, you talked about, Neil, was around accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So how in your partnerships do you create skin in the game when the incentives aren't equal, they're asymmetrical?
Yeah, really good question. So I think the first thing to say is they shouldn't be too asymmetric. I think a little bit of asymmetry is okay. But if one partner feels like they're not getting much from the alliance, then things will fizzle out pretty quickly, as you can imagine. But that doesn't mean to say that both partners are getting exactly the same thing. In my work, I'm often working in cross-sector partnerships. So, bringing together health services, universities, private sector, et cetera. Oftentimes, just as the capabilities that they're bringing into the alliance aren't the same, the kind of the benefits that they're getting out aren't the same thing. And I think that's fine. I think what the danger is here is not recognizing what those different benefits are, both internally, because sometimes your people aren't clear what the organization is getting out, so we need to name it and kind of make people aware of it. But it's also important through the alliance to understand what everyone's putting in and what everyone's getting out, because it just puts everything on the table, and it's about transparency more than anything else.
Yeah, that's good.
In the merger world, how might I guess the equivalent is, in mergers you often get that kind of size difference. A larger organization merging with a smaller organization.
Yeah.
Does that sort of play out in the same way, or how does that play out?
Yeah, I've worked and I'm currently working with mergers of equals and mergers of very different size and structured organizations. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. Firstly, and at risk of repeating what we said a few times, always retain that North Star as your focus, usually as the beneficiaries of your work, and keep them at the center of decision making, so that if a party has to give something up, and both parties will, You recognize that it's in the service of something greater than you or your organization. But that said, entering a merger process, you've got to be realistic about what you're bringing in and your own circumstances. So a merger of equals might include some level of trade-off. Organization X brings this, organization Y brings that. And the trade-off doesn't have to be perfectly balanced because you're still working in service of that higher purpose. But you'd expect some level of reciprocity, compromise on both sides in order to create something equal and achieve that classic 1+1=3 ambition of mergers. Best practice from over here, leadership over there, brand over here, that sort of thing. When there's an imbalance, a bigger organization and a smaller organization looking to work together, being candid, the smaller organization can't expect to take all the leadership roles and retain the dominant brand. It's just not realistic. You have to consider the assets that you bring to a partnership. And it might be that the organization has to articulate its priorities. Are priorities that clients come first, or that its staff retain jobs, or that director positions or a brand is brought into a merged entity. I've seen, for example, smaller organizational brands being used as program names within a bigger entity they merged into. There are many ways to deliver this, but if it's done sensitively and in the service of that shared purpose, these conversations can be uncomfortable, but they're absolutely necessary. And often it requires an outside voice to keep people aligned to that North Star. Just go, hold on, remember why we're here. Remember why we're here. Just remember, you've got to give something up in order to move forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that resonates with my experience. I've been in an organization that's merged with a smaller organization, and I recognize a lot of those things that you've just talked about.
The last point, the last of the 4 points in the article I read talked about an alliance mindset being the key word here. You said that an alliance win equals an organization win. So how do leaders get teams to live that idea of an alliance mindset, particularly when some functions contribute more than they might receive from an alliance or a partnership?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and actually one of my favorite topics to talk about at the moment. And it's really important because it really kind of speaks to when the rubber hits the road. Because the issue that you're kind of referring to here is often within an organization that's entered an alliance, things start to fester at the kind of the team level. Yeah. So the exec might be all on board and happy, but things start to fester at a team level. And people start to question, why do I need to do this when I've got so many other things that I need to do? Why do I need to kind of do this? I'm not getting anything personally from that.
Yeah.
And, then they kind of take the perspective, well, my parent organization requires me to do X, Y, and Z, and therefore the alliance stuff will just have to wait. That's a lower priority. That's understandable, but if we set things up correctly, it's also wrong, right? Because the alliance has been entered into for a reason, right? It ought to be a key priority of both organizations. Yeah. And so what I also talk about is an alliance mindset is actually a strategic mindset. It's one that understands the strategy of the organization, what we're trying to achieve, and how, servicing the alliance is actually furthering the kind of the more strategic goals of our organization. And that's what I mean when I say an alliance win is an organization win, even though you might not necessarily see that in the granular day to day, but it is, right. So we need our teams and our staff to actually prioritize servicing the alliance. But that requires leadership to explain the strategy and to communicate the strategy so people are able to kind of make that connection.
And I would also assume on a practical level, if people are expected to support a partnership or alliance on top of their business as usual, they've got to be resourced accordingly. Otherwise, people just see it's another thing I've got to do.
Absolutely. That's critical as well. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if you're asking teams to do more, you need to give them more resources. I think, teams can shoulder an extra burden for a little while, but, we need to be realistic and fair. And so that means in our alliance planning, we need to work out where the extra resource is needed. And that somewhat goes back to that asymmetry discussion. We might need to bolster teams that aren't getting additional workload through the kind of the organization business as usual stream, but they're getting extra workload for the alliance. And so that extra resource into team X actually might be mostly in service of our alliance partner, right? And so the kind of the benefits might be actually experienced by the alliance partner. But that's, again, why we need to take things up a level, have that shared purpose, understand the strategy, how things all fit together, so that we're understanding this team over here is getting an extra resource so that they can service that alliance.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's really important. In the merger world, again, we keep going back to that. There's also a mindset shift that is quite different, I think, from the alliance world. In our alliance world, I've talked about having that mindset of the alliance on top of our mindset towards our organization. But in mergers, you're going from our organization to one organization, right? So that feels quite different. What do you think is harder?
None of these are easy, right? If they were easy, people would do them more often. So there's a spectrum of collaboration. At one end, loose alliances, being friendly neighbors through things like communities of practice, shared advocacy, shared service, JVs, shared service models, and mergers are very much at the far end of the spectrum. And none of those approaches is wrong, but each of them brings with it them relative risks and rewards. I certainly believe the more governance structures you have, the more operational models you've got to work with, the harder life becomes. And the more time and effort spent on the machinations of your for-purpose organization, the less good work's being done. Now, maybe this is unique to the for-purpose sector, which is so resource constrained, but I spent a year working under 2 boards and a working group on top of managing two businesses. And it's really hard. And I could do it because only for a period of time, I knew I'd have to, work extra hours every day or weekends or whatever in order to get a merger over the line. But certainly it was really tough. My worry about JVs in the non-profit sector or kind of ongoing enduring partnerships, which are on top of business as usual, is they require that support indefinitely. And it's hard work to keep 2 organizations synchronized to support the machinations of joint venture, unless you're resourced to do that. And sadly, very few non-profit organizations get resource for this sort of project. They just expect hardworking CEOs to do more. And the idea of a partnership or a joint venture might be more comfortable because in theory it can be unpicked, unlike a merger, which is permanent, but it's harder. So I would question those organizations looking. I'm not saying it's to look at a JV or an alliance or other kind of intermediary structure as wrong, but I would question, are you sacrificing a better outcome for being less uncomfortable? And just consider the resource involved. I actually spoke to a CEO this week who's working on a joint venture, which is going well, generating new work. I actually spoke to a CEO this week who's working on a joint venture, which is going really well. It's generating new work, but it's on top of their business as usual. And they were already working 50 or 60 hours a week, and now this JV consumes more of their time. The organization hasn't resourced things properly, and the JV, unlike a merger, might not have a conclusion. So the CEO is struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel. At least in a merger, when it's done and dusted, you'll experience the benefits and the efficiencies from that merger. So look, I strongly believe if you recognize that working together with aligned organization is the most effective way, rephrase. I strongly believe if you recognize that working with an aligned organization is more effective than plowing on alone, you should work towards the best model, not settle for something a little bit more comfortable, but actually less practical.
Yeah, it sounds like we have similar conversations with our clients. One of my kind of slides that I bring out to a number of my clients is that kind of spectrum of quite loose informal partnerships down one end through MOUs and structured alliances, joint ventures, and ultimately going up to mergers. So yeah, it sounds like we have similar conversations, and there's pros and cons on all of those options, and you need to understand them and find the right option.
Yeah. So, Neil, in one of your articles, you talked about levers, 4 levers. Can you talk us through the 4 levers for an effective structuring an effective alliance, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, this isn't really my framework. This is a framework developed by a rather famous consulting company that really resonates with me, and so I've borrowed it and kind of reinterpreted it for alliance work that I do. So these are the 4 change levers to make things stick, right? Because as we said, forming alliances is hard, and if we're not deliberate and mindful about how we actually achieve these things, then things can go snap back to the way they were before pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
So I'll just kind of explain each of them. So lever number 1 is around understanding and conviction, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. For people to have that alliance mindset that I talked about earlier, and alliance mindset equals a strategic mindset, they need to understand what the strategy is, right? So the first thing that we need to do in alliances is once we've worked out what the strategy is, what our kind of North Star is, communicate that at length so everyone understands it, has been able to kind of ask questions about that, and not only understand what it means for the organization, but understand what it means for themselves. They need to understand what is expected of them, believe that they can act in that way, and want to, right? So there's an individual change that we need to trigger, and that's the first step. Once we've achieved that and we've got people that are G'd up, they're ready to go, they believe they can do what's required of them, if they then encounter resistance in kind of formal processes, structures, etc., they're just going to say, "Oh, this is too hard." So the second step, really important, often overlooked, often quite tricky, and takes a lot of time to get right, is looking at formal mechanisms, so structures, processes, workflows, etc. We need to make sure everything is actually working in the way that we're expecting through the alliance, the easy way, right? We can't expect our people to work around our systems in order to collaborate with our alliance partners. It's just not going to happen. Third thing, talent and skills, right? So people know what is expected of them, believe that they can do it, and the formal structures enable them to do that. We need to make sure that they actually have the skills and the capability to work in the new way, right? So they might be keen to give it a go, but we actually need to provide the training that they require. And actually, in the example of alliances, this is often one of the key benefits that we're getting from the alliance, right? So this often means alliance organization 1 providing training to alliance organization 2, right? And so if that's what we're looking to do, we need to make sure that we're enabling people to give their time to the other organization.
Yeah.
So this somewhat links into that previous lever, but we need to make sure that we've got protected time for all people to actually spend training, working with their alliance partners. Finally, and crucially, is role modeling, right? If you've got people that say, yeah, I understand what I need to do, I'm up for it, I've got the skills now, the processes are fine, and they look at their leaders who are not behaving in that way, they'll soon start to think, well, if they're not doing it, why should I? Right. Yeah. So role modeling is critically important. So we need the leaders from both organizations, or if it's a multiple organization alliance, all of those organizations to work well together, right? So they need to be seen to be working well together. That doesn't mean they need to always agree, but they need to, have constructive dialogue, be visibly working as a team, right? And you know, even subtle things, right? So when you see it, you know, a meeting of the alliance leaders, does organization one sit on one side of the boardroom and organization two sit on the other? That immediately signals to me we're not a team yet.
Very nice. Yeah.
So you know, those types of subtle role modeling are really important. But also, you know, part of role modeling is celebrating success. When people start acting in the new way that we're expecting from the alliance, we need to recognize that and celebrate that. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to celebrate, you know, $1 million deal that's being executed, but we need to celebrate the behaviors that we want to see, especially in the early stages. So celebrate that, you know, Professor X, sorry, not X-Men, professor from, you know, university and clinician from hospital have started working together, and it's really exciting. We don't know where it's going to go yet, but we can just celebrate that they're having a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, that's great.
You might pick up that I digest quite a lot of business books. I really like the series by Ken Blanchard, and in one of his books, he talks about kind of managers catching people doing the right thing, you know, as a kind of contrast to a lot of managers will catch people doing the wrong thing and berate them.
Yeah.
I think a really important idea here is catching people doing the right thing and celebrating them. I think that's what I need in terms of role modeling, because it's those subtle small things that you just want to say, hey, I saw you had that conversation. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And can move on that way. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
I'm hoping that some of this translates into your realm. Do you see the same 4 levers in your realm? And you know, if so, where do you experience them breaking?
Yes is the answer. I think they play out really clearly in full purpose mergers. Going through that last example of role modeling before I draw the parallels, one way to think about it, do everything that David Brent didn't do through the Swindon and Slough merger.
Yes.
Okay, so if there's 4 levers, the first is understanding and conviction. How that might play out in a full purpose merger is articulating that higher purpose, agreeing an objective of working together, and documenting those things so that they're on paper and everyone says, no, that is it, we're in. You talk about formal mechanisms. So I think the most important thing in a full purpose merger is to draw out the constraints, concerns, issues, non-negotiables early and put a plan in place to work through these and towards the objective. But I would also say there are structures like decision-making frameworks, KPIs, etc., that also governance documents that sit alongside that. But the plan that is bespoke to the reality of the 2 organizations is the key mechanism through which to work. The third lever that you mentioned was talent and skills. So yes, in the full purpose context, the biggest risk is expecting a merger to be delivered as part of business as usual, or giving it to an already overburdened CEO or a couple of CEOs to deliver. So I would suggest in the resource constrained environment, having some sort of working group that includes directors from both organizations, support to the CEOs, because some of the work will fall to them and you don't want to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. You do need external support at various points, whether it be consultants to kind of set the plan and help you through those early discussions, or lawyers to draw up deeds, or branding experts to help on kind of the merged entity brands. And just to watch out on that, I have seen several full-purpose organizations that have a director with corporate M&A experience on their board and go, we've got this covered, right? We've got a director here who's done some big multi-billion-dollar M&A deals. And the reality of nonprofits is very, very different. Different motivations. Nobody gets rich through a merger process. And so whilst that experience can be valuable, it shouldn't be the sole direction towards a working group or a process. And the last lever you talked about was role modeling. Yeah, absolutely. Leaders need to role model the language and the behaviors they want their teams to adopt. I think it's sensible to put in place a communications plan and to agree what are the words we'll use to articulate and describe this collaboration. Are you going to use the M word from the beginning or only after a certain point? What are the words you want to avoid? So in the most recent merger I was an executive for, as soon as anyone said that Brisbane team or that Sydney team, you had to jump on that. It's no. It's my colleague that is based in Brisbane, and those small things do mean a lot. Last point I say is you can't over communicate through this process. The lack of information can create a vacuum that malevolent forces can step into. So if in doubt, over communicate.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think one of those levers that I think is particularly, I guess, important in a merger is those formal mechanisms, because you are literally bringing two organizations together. I wonder if it's worth saying a little bit more about those formal mechanisms and what that looks like in terms of bringing organizations together, in terms of, delegations, reporting lines, budgets, KPIs, governance charters, etc.
The most important element I feel is the creation of the right sort of working group that represents both organizations. That often looks like a couple of directors from both boards and maybe the CEOs with some independent facilitator, arbiter. And when that group is set up, the key thing is to give them the right level of empowerment so that they can be nimble enough and make decisions while still having the right level of engagement back to the board on key moments. So a working group that has to go back to the board at every step of the full board at every step of the way is just a waste of time. It's just another level of governance for the sake of it. A working group that's empowered to make a series of the decisions that keep the process moving forward, fantastic. Refer back to the board at maybe 2 or 3 or 4 key moments along the journey, but that model works very well. Absolutely. Articulate KPIs, prepare charters and budgets. And by budgets, I mean money to spend on the collaboration. So whether it's engaging lawyers or consultants or other expert support, or giving support to the CEO, because as I've said a couple of times, one of the risks going through a merger process is that the CEO has to carry a lot of burden on top of already a really busy business as usual role. But the same idea is true, I think, also for volunteer directors. If a director steps onto a working group that is empowered and meeting regularly, they need to know that that's going to take a couple of hours a week, for example, and have the capacity to do that. Not everyone does. So selection of the right people onto that working group is a bit of a skill as well.
Yeah, my ears pricked up when you talked about empowered working groups, because I completely feel that as well, having worked with working groups that are empowered versus working groups that are not empowered. And as I've said a number of times, alliance work is hard, and it becomes so much harder if the working group isn't empowered, and it takes so much longer, right? A lot of the work that I do, we've got like decades long time horizons as it is, but if the working groups aren't empowered, we're kind of swimming through treacle. We can't move. And you know what started off as a 10-year journey becomes an impossible journey, right? So I completely agree. Empowered working groups is so important.
Okay, so we want to now talk about a couple of case studies to make some of the concepts we talked about a little bit more tangible.
One of the case studies that I saw from your website, I think it was a national defederation program. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. And I'd be particularly interested in kind of where those moments of kind of alliance mindset mattered more than technical execution.
Okay, I can give 2 examples here. So I think personalities can make or break these collaborations. Just this morning, I was speaking to a CEO in a federated structure who said that all organizations are running pretty well and that there were no rogue CEOs, and there had been in the past. And for anyone who's worked in a federation, it's an unusual experience where there's no rogue entity or leader. So to them, the federation was working well, and they didn't see a need to explore moving from a fairly loose federated structure to something more deep and possibly even consolidating. And look, I understand their point, but frankly, they're wrong. Because when things are going okay is the best time to explore a merger. Not when there are rogues running around, not when one of the state entities is in crisis, not when there's infighting within the federation. You need to do it when people get on with each other so that the brands are strong, finances are not creating distractions or panics. People get on well so you can have tough conversations, and then organizations can invest in some of the short-term costs towards the collaboration being effective. Thankfully, I am working right now with a national federation that's doing it from a position of strength. Everyone's aligned, and thus far, everyone seems willing to sacrifice something: self-interest, autonomy, parochialism, in order to do something better for their clients. And it's really empowering when that's done from a position of strength. But that talks about getting the process started. Once you're working on a merger process, the value of an alliance mindset is more important when fear starts to influence decisions. So that might play as fear of betraying history, or fear of it's different over here, or fear of loss of identity or own interest, or domination by a big state in a federation. And the way to address this is to be guided always by your North Star, even if it uncovers a hard truth. So asking what's in the best interests of our clients tomorrow, and being brave and holding true to that shared purpose and the initial commitment you made is the only way to put beneficiaries first and move past those challenging moments, which will inevitably come up, particularly if personalities through this process change and you start when everyone gets on and then some of the faces change. You still need to hold true to that initial intent and that Northern Star.
Yeah, got it.
So can you tell me about the Puerto Rico Clinical Trials Consortium, which sounds very exotic?
Yes.
Why did a new entity and target operating model matter?
Yep.
And what governance choices made it workable?
Yeah, it's I'm surprised I haven't told you about this before. It's usually the first story that I go to when I meet someone new in a professional context. It's probably one of my kind of career defining projects. So it was a project that I worked on in a previous organization, a Big Four organization, but it was the project that made me think, oh, I love this experience of working with lots of different organizations to achieve a single purpose. So it really was the project that spawned the idea in the back of my mind to set up Health Advance Connect. Anyway, the story of the Puerto Rico Clinical Trial Consortium, or the Consortium for Clinical Investigation, as it became called, was Puerto Rico has a lot going for it in terms of clinical trials. There were a number of clinical trial units. It's a US territory, so it's under FDA regulation, which actually counts for a lot if you're using clinical trial data to get a product on the market. And comparative to other US centers, it was a bit cheaper. So there was a lot going for it, but the issue was there was a number of smaller clinical trial units, and they weren't able to market themselves basically individually to the global decision makers that kind of decide where clinical trials go individually. So it really was, it's kind of like that peak body argument, right? So collectively, we can achieve more than we can achieve individually. So that's really, in essence, where the Consortium for Clinical Investigation came from. Right, so the entity that we set up really was about kind of enabling collaboration between the clinical trial units, but also being that externally facing organization to take Puerto Rico's clinical trial capabilities to the world, right, okay, and attract clinical trial volume into the island. So it needed to represent Puerto Rico and its clinical trial capabilities overall and not have any bias or preference to any single clinical trial unit, which is why we had to set up a separate entity, right? So, if we had some kind of partnership born out of one of the other clinical trial units, or just ask them to kind of work together in a different way, I don't think we would have been able to kind of bring together actually the capital to kind of operate the consortium, because we needed to hire people that can actually go and meet people at conferences, etc., around the world. But also, I think bias would creep in. So neutrality was really important. The consortium needed to represent everyone equally and bring opportunities to the group on an equal basis. That's not to say, we needed to have an understanding of differential capabilities, so we knew where to take the right opportunities of clinical trials to the right clinical trial units. But that is a neutral judgment based on capability, not on a preference for anyone's business over another. So that's why we had to set up a new entity, and with that comes setting up a target operating model that understands the right people and the right ways of working across the consortium to achieve the ultimate purpose of bringing more clinical trials into the island.
Okay, and it was successful?
It was. This is a project of, it will be 10 years ago this year, and it's still going. The island of Puerto Rico has faced a number of setbacks in general with hurricanes, and there's been a lot of kind of talent leaving the island. But I did catch up with them last year, and the entity is still going strong and it's growing. And quite pleasingly, when I look at their website, they are still talking about the same strategic pillars that we set up 10 years ago.
Nice.
Either means they haven't bothered to change them, or hopefully what that means is it's still working for them.
Yeah, good stuff. Neil, we'll jump straight to those quick fire things because we're running out of time and I've got to jump off the call. Okay, so we're going to go 3 quick fire questions. The focus of individuals on themselves rather than on their higher purpose, their vision, or a focus on the organization's history, i.e. looking backwards rather than forwards, speaks to me this is not an organization ready to embark on a collaboration or a possible merger.
Yeah, that makes sense. My answer would be no history of collaboration, right? So if we're exploring a formal alliance and the organizations haven't worked together on anything like, we talked about that spectrum earlier, if they haven't worked lower down the spectrum, then exploring a formal alliance probably isn't going to work yet.
Okay, a green flag that says this partnership will survive setbacks. I think if all parties buy into a shared purpose as their North Star, they explicitly and usually documented on paper agree to put aside personal or organizational interests for that shared purpose, and they share their commitment with others, that I think speaks volumes for their commitment to that process.
Yeah, I agree. For me, my answer is aligned leadership. We've spoken about this, but alliances are hard, but most things are solvable, but we can only solve them with leadership working together. So if we don't have, I'm turning green into a red flag, if the alliance isn't, the leadership isn't aligned, we won't be able to solve those problems.
Okay. And the metric that matters most in year 1 of a partnership. For me, in the for-purpose sector, it's client impact, whether that be seen in numbers, outcomes, client satisfaction, or experience. But if I could be indulged, the secondary metrics would be staff and board engagement through the process and the realization of financial benefits that were part of the driver.
Yeah. For me, I've gone a different way. It's more shared meetings than separate ones. What I sometimes see is organizations having their internal meetings to discuss what they want to discuss before they come to the alliance meeting, and then they won't commit to anything and they'll go back and go. If you're constantly going back to your own organization tent, it means you're not actually working on anything together in the alliance and you're spending so much time not working with your alliance partners. So yeah, what I like to see is as essentially ditching the internal meetings for only the unless it's really kind of critical. Usually this is when we're coming to kind of legal considerations. But most of the meetings should be together as alliance partners working things out.
Good stuff. Okay. So we're now going to give one sentence takeaway and then who should contact us. So I'll go first. So my one sentence takeaway is, in the for purpose world, it's incumbent upon us to be brave and have conversations that might take us beyond our current paradigm, to set aside fear or parochialism or ego or self-interest and organizational history in order to better serve our beneficiaries.
I've got a much shorter sentence. Alliances are delivered, but I can't say it. I've got a short sentence for you. Alliances are delivered by people with a shared purpose. I think that's the nut of it. So who should contact you and what should they contact you about?
Brave chairs, directors and CEOs who are either challenged by long-term sustainability or who want to explore better ways to achieve their vision. I can help guide them to and through that process. Who should contact you and what for?
So any organization in the health and life sciences ecosystem, be that universities, health services, hospitals, private providers, anyone in that ecosystem that might be exploring a new alliance or is working through a new alliance and things aren't quite coming together. Sometimes an external perspective can be catalytic to get things moving in the right direction, particularly with someone like me that's been through a number of these types of programs in the past.
Good stuff.
Excellent.
We've got about 2 minutes over, but that was really good.